Morning, folks. Welcome to day two. Our speaker is running a little late, so expect a 5-10 minute delay. Morning, guys. So, Madhusudan here will be talking about Bharat QR and is it addressing the real Bharat? Madhusudan works for YAP in Mumbai. This talk focuses on the basics of Bharat QR, where we are in the market, the traction that we've had, and how does it pan out over the next 12 months.
Okay. Thank you, and my apologies, I got a bit late. So I'll spend the next 30 minutes talking about what Bharat QR and what has it done in the last year or so, and how does it sort of pan out, and what it sort of entails for the digital payments as a as a business in India. And we'll also sort of have some time for Q&A towards the end. So Bharat QR is essentially an initiative mooted by the government last year after demonetization, where there was a need to address the challenges around having multiple QR codes. I mean, to sort of step back and say what a QR code is. You typically, most of us are aware, it's basically an abbreviated the abbreviation is quick response code, which is nothing but a two-dimensional metric barcode, which started getting used initially in the manufacturing industry, and then over time it has sort of seen major adoption in payments, largely led by the internet behemoths in China. So today, QR is probably the largest form of digital payments method globally. To sort of give a perspective, WeChat last year processed almost about 800 billion US, which is a third of India's GDP, on QR code based payments. So a similar number for Alipay and so on and so forth. So as a form factor, it has found a lot of relevance in payments, which is what we are, we're hoping that we will be able to replicate that success in India. And the fundamental reason why it's seen this massive adoption is on three counts. One, it is cheap, it's inexpensive, and it's almost free, right? Factors that matter a lot for a country like India, where there is no value sort of ascribing that happens. Anything that is sort of inexpensive, people tend to sort of adopt a lot more and embrace. So what really is this QR, right? So it basically is a mobile channel for the existing payment ecosystem that we are all used to. So we all have a debit and a credit card in our wallets. We use them based on transaction ticket size, based on the offers that are being provided. Essentially, there was a need to sort of look at or bridge the gap between card and mobile, right? Until last year, you had mobile payment products that are created by companies that had a tech-enabled sort of outlook. So someone like a Paytm went out and created an ecosystem and said, I will own this customer experience and I'll drive the way consumers should spend. So thereby, they created what's called an island of closed loop, right? So it will, if you were to participate in that network, you'll necessarily have to have a Paytm app, and you'll have to take money from your existing bank account and move it to the to the Paytm wallet, or any other bank wallet. What that means is that as a user, you're constrained to sort of take money in and use it in a certain way that is prescribed by the ecosystem. But if you look at how the cards world operate, as a user, you don't really care which bank has provided a POS machine. All you do is that after your transaction is over, it's so habituated for all of us now that we don't tend to actually worry about which bank has given the machine, whether it will work or not. We just present the card and the payment just happens, right? So there was and the whole card operates in a what's called as a four-party model. There are four players in the ecosystem. There is a issuing bank which issues the card. There is an acquiring bank which goes and signs up merchants, puts up devices and all that. There's a merchant who actually needs to collect money from the consumer, and there is a nodal agency called as the payment network, which is nothing but the Visa, Mastercard, and in India and PCI. So these four parties actually sort of have a commerce that's happening between them. So the merchant typically receives the money, and everybody else other than the issuer actually relays that money to the merchant, right? So from the consumer. So if I were a consumer, I have to pay a merchant. The money goes from my bank account into the consumer's receivable. In that transaction, the merchant benefits because he's getting that money. So he's actually ready to discount that transaction, and that's why the term merchant discount rate, you'll find in the merchant parlance, being quoted, which is essentially that the merchant is discounting his transaction. He's ready to take a lower value because there is a sale that's happening for them, and it's adding to his sort of bottom line. So the important aspect of having an interoperable sort of payment network is to ensure that this four-party model economics is preserved, and it runs on the existing ecosystem, because only when there is money on the table, issuers will be interested. Only when reward points are there, you as consumers will be interested to sort of use that over cash. So there is a lot of motivation that gets built into for each of the ecosystem players for them to be adopting the existing model. And also, what Bharat QR meant was that you could actually go after use cases which card found hard to attack. Something like a cash at POS, something like a cash on delivery, where most of us, when we opt for a cash on delivery at home, either we will not have change, or we would have left money with someone at home. They may not be available at home. So all these new use cases, which card systems struggle to handle, because inherently it was a capex heavy, infrastructure led, hardware led model, where Bharat QR is sort of addressing. I'll talk about it in detail in the coming slides. And from a stakeholder standpoint, it's imperative for the issuer, which is the bank that is issuing the card, to see how can consumers adopt and more and more use cases around payments. Thereby, at a very fundamental level, issuers make money when you start going digital, right? Because if you compare how payments happen, when you take money from the ATM, let's say somebody who's drawing a 10,000 rupee salary, he goes to the ATM, pulls out the entire 10,000 rupees. There is no money left for the bank to actually make on the float, right? So if he were to spend that 10,000 rupees, assuming he spends equally distributed over 30 days, which practically doesn't happen, but that runoff period is about 30 days before the money comes to zero, in a digital sort of world. So it's imperative from a issuing bank standpoint, from their CASA mobilization standpoint, that they ensure that there is more and more consumer adoption around digital payments. So which will actually sort of add to their bottom line. And any use case that helps them to achieve this, all of us wonder, why would banks provide a free book my show ticket, right? So that's the first use case where you will find, which is a small ticket. You would not mind taking that first plunge. You would not mind saying, what if this goes wrong? It's only a 200 rupee risk that I'm taking, but the reward of that risk is that I'll get another ticket free. So the customer action from the issuer action from a customer activation and driving digital payment will always be a small ticket transaction. We are all now, pretty much every one of us in the room would have tried a Google Pay transaction to do a P2P, and earn probably multiples of that 50 rupees. It's all aided towards building an habit and making sure that use case sort of gets adopted. So what goes into the QR is essentially the traditional card networks, which is basically your debit, prepaid, and credit card products. We also have an India-specific asset which is called UPI, which I'm sure all of you in the room are aware. It basically moves money from one bank account to the other using a virtual payment address. It's an enhancement, or it's probably a 2.0 of what PayPal did 20 years ago in the US, where you could just send somebody money with just their email address, right? So UPI has seen massive adoption. The numbers that NPCI quotes is like 150 million transactions last month, and it's all P2P currently. But P2P, there's only so much money that you will have to give to your friend or neighbor or rent. But the P2M, which is payments to merchants, is probably in hundreds of millions of transactions that happen. So it's imperative, even from a UPI success standpoint, the low-hanging fruit is P2P, and what some of the large internet companies are trying to drive. But at a very fundamental level, unless they are able to crack the P2M story, which is merchant payments in a small ticket and in an economically viable model, UPI will have a long road to sort of cover. Aadhaar is also been thrown into the QR mix. It's not yet seen adoption as yet. Aadhaar has its own sort of challenges, but the QR as it stands today also captures the merchant's Aadhaar. somewhere, in the roadmap, there is an opportunity to sort of also work on other as a payment method. So how does it work? Essentially, you have a card that you are having in your pocket. The same card gets represented in a phone, which is nothing but your mobile banking app, or your the wallet application that your bank provides, enables you to pay using the same card, right? So you then what happens in the bank system is that if it is their own merchants, let's say you bank with State Bank of India and it's a State Bank of India account, it just goes into their internal systems to sort of get processed. If it is some other bank, then they sort of route it to the network, and they follow the standard network processing. You as a consumer will always use the same card, so your experience from a user perspective will continue to remain the same. If you're earning reward points by using a certain credit card, you'll continue to earn the same reward points. The single difference between the two models is that in a card world, it's a what's it's called as a pull payment. So the merchant is pulling money from your account, and in a QR world, it's a push payment. So you are actually pushing. It's more like a bank transfer that you undertake, right? So you are opening. So it's like you doing a recharge from your phone. You actually given a number to be recharged. You enter the amount. You submit that request, and the request gets taken care of. Instead of entering that mobile number to do a recharge, you actually scan a QR code, which is the merchant's account. So that has a huge bearing in terms of how the QR deployment happens. Simply because when you allow somebody to pull money, there is always a chance that that person can pull an incorrect amount, pull when you are not authorized. So there's whole chargeback or a dispute management that gets built in. So there's a risk profiling that the banks will have to do. So they need to ensure that this merchant is not a rogue merchant, so he goes around and pulls money from everybody's account. So the cost of taking a merchant on board when it is a pull payment where there's a hardware led model is significantly higher, which we'll sort of cover as we go along. So that's the principal difference. And what that means is that as a user, there's a huge challenge around adoption that happens, right? So today, when you go to a restaurant, with friends, you actually hand over the card. A lot of people actually hand over the pin as well, which is not the right thing to do. But there's the whole experience is something that the merchant sort of manages. The waiter will bring in the POS machine. You enter just the pin. You are not participating in the transaction. You're a passive player. But when it comes to mobile, you are actually participating. You have to take your phone out. You have to open an app. There should be network. So there's a lot of dependency that gets built in, and there's an habit forming that has to sort of go in terms of making sure that you are able to adopt this as a payment method, which is one of the challenges that QR is facing as we speak today. And how the payment flows is essentially that I sort of mentioned it. So you have an app where this facility is sort of enabled. You scan a QR code that is present at the merchant. Most of us must have seen at least a Paytm QR code in shops. So the QR represents the merchant data. So what that when you scan the QR code, what it says is that who's the shop, what is his shop name, and in some cases, what is the amount that you're paying, right? And then you will authenticate it using your existing, whatever is the pin that you have or the protocol that you have for that particular mobile app, and you're going to sort of confirm it. In the backend, it flows through the bank and the network and all of that, and the merchant just receives a confirmation in the form of a notification. While it looks very simple from a framework and how it works, there are fundamental reasons why we have to sort of look at mobile and QR as a big component of how digital payments can be driven. It sort of goes back to what are the barriers to sort of adoption of a card payment itself, right? So if you look at why somebody doesn't use, we are a country where we have about 800 million debit cards, and at an average of about 1.6 or 1.7 per household. The reason why a lot of people don't use a debit card is the primary reason is that there is a fear of their account getting sort of compromised, which is essentially the number one fear. People don't use the card, and this was proven when in 2009 when RBI allowed or rather mandated that all online transactions have to be two-factor authenticated, which is you have to do an OTP just to make sure there is no fraudulent transaction that happens. The adoption of online payments actually sort of went through the roof. It grew at almost about 3x for the next 2 to 3 years. It continues to grow at maybe 1.5 to 2x of what if face-to-face merchant transaction happens. There's also other very nuanced reasons, like you don't want to pay because a lot of people think that if you pay digitally, you probably come under the tax net. There is the in the 90s, when Citibank used to run the only credit card business, people used to get tax notice because they paid 3 or 4 lakhs in credit card bill payments in a year. So that fear of taxation is very very strong. There's also the big reason around I cannot use it, right? Which is saying that whenever I present the card, the merchant says I will charge you 1% more. We'll face this as soon as you step out of Bangalore, you go to Mysore, you go to any of the highways, the guy will say I'll charge you 1% more. So that inherently sort of builds in from a consumer mindset standpoint, saying that I cannot use the card because I am going to end up paying more. Also, the digital channels are still not sort of evolved to a state where you can say that it's all pervasive. So you cannot leave home saying that I don't need my wallet. I can run my entire sort of payment needs just on the mobile, right? This is from a consumer side. If you look at it from a merchant side, there are even more sort of grappling issues that are there. Today there are 4 quadrants. This is your sweet spot in terms of where you will find POS. Tier 1 cities, organized retail, hotels and all of that, where card is a given. You don't worry about when you step into a multi-cuisine restaurant asking them whether you'll accept card or not. So it's a given. You'll have if you sort of go to a QSR, if you go to a Adigas in Bangalore, they may or may not accept card because depending on the throughput and how the merchant feels that whether this is good or bad for him. So this is where you'll find a Square or a dongle like devices prevalent. Small merchant who probably does 2 or 3 lakhs of business monthly. He would not want to go take a large POS machine, but to keep his consumers happy, they'll have MPOS, which is nothing but a Square kind of a dongle which goes into the phone that is getting adopted. You have a large segment which is sort of completely untapped. The reasons being that there banks are not able to underwrite these consumers. There is not enough throughput. So every POS machine that goes out in the market, there is a capex of handling that particular machine. So a machine will cost about 10 to 11 grand. Is there enough volume for the bank to actually see return on that investment, or is the merchant ready to pay something like a rental so that their costs are covered? The answers sort of remain in between no and negative. So there is from a acquirer side, there is a high cost of selection. If I send FOS to sign up 10 merchants, you will have underwriting that will reject 5 or 6 merchants. So every merchant that gets acquired comes at a price where merchants are the acquirers are saying I will only do tier 1 towns where we know for a fact there is enough volume for the business case to get justified. From the merchant side, if you look at it, again, tax avoidance is a big issue. They're always caught in this cash cycle. They pay their suppliers in cash. They collect money from their customers in cash. So getting out of this cash cycle becomes a challenge. Also, until last year, you had most of these smaller merchants having no outlook in terms of what taxes they have to pay, right? With GST, pretty much there is an inclusion of taxation that is happening. So no longer you will find merchants saying that I am not part of the tax net, but everybody is part of that. Uh, so the consumer side of the issue, if you look at, I'm always sort of earning in cash. I don't have a need to sort of deposit this into an account and use them. I don't find that value. That becomes a single biggest reason. And there is also not enough points where you can actually make that money fungible. So if you have cash, can I go to an outlet, put that money without incurring any cost so that I make it digital? Those touch points do not exist today. So which is where all of these reasons sort of contribute to having a form factor which is inexpensive, which is easy to deploy. That's where the sort of QR comes in. what Bharat QR is doing is that it actually is bundling in various different digital payment methods into one unified interface. The QR that I put out, you can pay using your Axis Bank, mobile banking app. You could pay using your HDFC Pays app. You could pay using your Google Pays, which is pretty much the top three apps used by any of an upwardly mobile consumer. Um, and it also sort of creates a funnel where merchant banks, when they sort of look at merchants, if there are merchants who are actually driving a lot of the digital payment, then they can look at a funnel whereby they can focus on merchants who are revenue accretive from their standpoint, and probably provide a physical POS or a MPOS. You will find a lot of the bank logos at the bottom. What that means is that uh, today, as we speak, there are like 50 banks in the country, and if you look at acquirers, which is the banks that put up the POS machine, almost there are only about 5 banks that contribute to about 90% of the volume, right? 90% of the machines that have been deployed. The reason being that, and these are like HDFC and Axis, ICICI, State Bank of India. The reason why only these 5 banks focus on acquiring is that one, there is a huge capex that needs to go in, and number two, they all have a captive base of customers whom they can drive to these merchants. So, from a bank perspective, any large bank that has a large consumer base will find it lucrative for them to actually offer the merchant side of the story as well. But when you look at these smaller banks, where there are probably have 10, 15 million consumers, suddenly the sort of ecosystem changes. They can offer it pretty much to their own current account holders, their own merchant, and that makes the business case viable for them as well. So what QR has done is essentially opening up the whole merchant ecosystem to a significantly large number of banks to begin with. So they will now find transactional revenues accruing based on whatever transaction that happens on this, and it's completely focused on tier 2, tier 3, where some of these banks are very strong. So if you look at a Karur Vysya bank, they are very strong in a Coimbatore, Tirupur belt, which an ICICI or any other bank would not want to sort of invest so much of energy to drive digital payments in those markets. So from a QR adoption standpoint, you'll find a new breed of banks which will come in and say that we will want to offer this only to our consumers because we feel that this is the right thing to do. And when you do that, you also have to sort of be mindful of the fact that this is not a fleet on street led acquisition where you can send 100 people out to acquire, but simply keep it completely digital, right? So which means that the banks offer it only to their customers, so they will ensure that their current account holders have a method to adopt, which means you make it completely digital from an acquisition standpoint. So you don't have to have a paper form filled in, have to have a person going in and signing up the merchant. So today we are seeing for the first time a banking product where you don't need an ink signature. You can do it completely digitally, simply because that merchant is already banking with a Karur Vysya or a Lakshmi Vilas bank, and we are already seeing some of this happening in the market where consumer, like the way a consumer would download an app, get themselves registered. You have a merchant who is actually downloading an app, he's linking it to his bank account, and he can pretty much start accepting payments from the word go, right? So this is very different from the world in the POS, which is the physical infrastructure world, where it used to take 20 days for the merchant to get the machine because there's a whole logistics involved in getting him the machine. So today you are in a situation where you can sort of pretty much sit in a central location, call up your merchant and say, you can download and start accepting money from your consumers using Beam. And there is also a merchant incentivization that banks do where there is a cashback that comes in, there is a offer of no rental for them. There's a whole goodie bag that sort of gets thrown in to make sure there is adoption that's happening. So this what this means from an economic standpoint is that in the traditional POS world, if it costed X rupees to deploy, run, operate a merchant business, in the Bharat QR world, it's almost down to a fourth or a fifth of that delta. Banks inherently will then sort of see value in, even if the merchants don't adopt, or even if there's high level of inactivity because consumers are not paying using that, they will still continue to invest in making sure that, at least the product is out there. Um, so you know there's a lot of talk about app getting adopted. I also sort of mentioned that there's an app that they have to download. But if you go to if you go to a small time shop, if panwala, he will never want to take money digitally. That's the truth of it, right? He thinks that, if the cash is in hand, he thinks that, that's the best form to sort of take it. But if we have to drive this adoption, we have done a lot of work around what form factors this can take. Can this go into a billing system, where you can integrate into their billing system? They don't need to actually have a hardware. Can you give them an app? App has not seen any adoption at all. Variety of reasons. There is no data. I don't want to leave a smartphone with the guy or the girl at the counter because they'll start browsing some other stuff on the during the free time. Is there a front end, web-based front end that you can provide? If there's a computer, a lot of the pharmacies typically have a computer to place orders. Is there a web-based front end that we can provide, or a simple SMS would do? So overwhelmingly, we found that just an SMS is all that is required to service the merchant payment side of it. The fundamental reason being that while there is smartphone that is there in the hands of the consumer, a lot of the merchant, a lot of them are not yet app heavy, right? They keep it because of they use Share It, they use YouTube, and they use WhatsApp. Anything beyond that, they probably do not see, do not want to adopt, because it just one, they don't understand. Number two, it probably is not in the in the language that they're comfortable with, right? So while there is smartphone, there is no app usage, is what we have figured. We had given out free phones to merchants to see adoption. The only thing that happened was that the data would get consumed, and when the customer shows up to make a payment, there is no way for them to receive money. So we have gone to a mode where we tell merchants to buy a 500 rupee phone, tie it to their till, and put a Reliance Jio SIM card. So that is the only investment that they'll have to make to ever go adopt digital payments. So what that means is that if you look at the constraints that I spoke about, and what it means from a Bharat QR standpoint, is that uh, we had it was an expensive proposition to go digital, because you have to pay a rental, you have to pay an upfront money. That pretty much becomes zero. There was a fear of taxation which was there. If I start taking money from my consumers digitally, will I come under the tax net? That GST is actually paving way for a tax inclusion. MDR was a big worry for merchants. Why should I pay a banker 1% of my hard-earned money when my consumer is ready to pay in cash for the full value? Which is where the government stepped in last year and said that we will bankroll for up to 2,000 rupees. The merchant need not pay that value. Government has given a big thrust to this. So any small merchant who takes, rather any merchant who takes less than 2,000 rupee transaction, there's actually no cost. It's on par with cash as we speak today. There's also this challenge around employee training. Smaller the shop, you have people attriting probably every 2 or 3 months. So you have this constant challenge of a new guy who comes in and he doesn't know how to operate a POS machine, or how to operate a mobile app if it's an applet product. When you make it as idiot proofed as an SMS, and how you can read an SMS and complete a transaction, that's the easiest way to sort of train employees. There are two hard parts that are still there. One around habit change from a consumer side. The other is how good is it sort of over a cash, right? These two are not there are no quick fix to this. One, we are actually seeing a lighting up of merchant transactions primarily led by cashbacks, because we are all used to that. We've seen that over the last 2-3 years. Some of the wallet companies have offered it, so we would use a Paytm or a MobiKwik if there is a merchant offer that is running, or if I'm going to get 10 rupee back. So this aspect of greed being fulfilled will will actually help drive build habit. So as some of these large internet companies look at use case beyond P2P, beyond paying a rent, you will start finding that they will want to focus on how merchant payments can be driven. So to that extent, habit forming will take time, will take a lot of marketing dollars, which if not the bank, someone like a Google or a WhatsApp will come in and say, we have in it all the interest to sort of promote this. Uh, from a merchant standpoint, there's also another aspect which is very, very critical, which is around access to finance, right? Today, if a small merchant want where to take a loan, if all his transactions were in cash, there is no way for a banker or a asset provider to underwrite that consumer, right? We all see some form or other of an alternate lending platform. They read your social media profile. They sort of tell you that you are at this salary structure, so we can give you a 50,000 rupee loan in 3 minutes, right? How does that translate to a merchant? Can that digital adoption pave way for access to credit, thereby enabling him to get access to a better working capital and help him build that business, which is also something that's being worked upon. So you will find the payment as a railroad on which credit products will start getting built up. You already have a number of, I think, about half a dozen startups that are working in this space, well-funded companies like NeoGrowth, who are focusing on the POS-based merchant collection and underwriting them based on that. In a mobile world, that becomes even more simpler, even more a lot more data rich. So asset providers will find merchants who adopt digital payments easier for them to underwrite, easier for them to collect, because when consumers start paying, you'll have a collection like that happens on a daily basis. There's some money that is coming in. So if you're able to create a product where you go to a bank, say that I will run the risk for you, but help me collect from these merchants on a daily basis. So those are the products that will evolve and probably drive adoption. To sort of summarize, this whole QR based payment will see adoption in India in a massive way. As we speak, we have about 500,000 merchants. Many of us would not have seen a QR code in the merchants whom we frequent, but India is a very large sort of country, so 500,000 is still a drop in the ocean. We probably need 20x of that in the year or two. Um, with that, I'll stop. I have about 7 or 8 minutes to take questions. These are some of the use cases that are there.
Can you just expand on the SMS part of it? So an SMS is going to the merchant and he's just opening the SMS to show the Bharat QR.
Yeah. So there is a static. So this is a merchant outlet, a QR code displayed at a merchant outlet, right? You as a consumer would just pick up your phone. He says that 100 rupees the bill amount. You want to scan this QR. You will enter the amount that you need to pay. You will authenticate at your side, and when you say pay, your account gets debited. The money moves through the payment network and the bank. It reaches the acquiring bank, who has contracted the merchant, and all that the merchant needs to know is he has received that money, right? That notification part of it is where the SMS comes in. So you don't really need to have him open a smartphone, toggle into that app and see whether that money has been received. As long as he's trained to read an SMS and say that yes, 100 rupees has been received from you, he should be good.
So do we have an idea around the turnaround time this whole process takes, and whether it is viable for high volume, high throughput businesses like a restaurant which sees a lot of people coming in and stuff?
Yeah. So in fact, the first, I mean, it's almost real time. It's like sending a WhatsApp message, right? It pretty much takes the same amount of time, subject to network latencies and all that. But the early adopters in this product is actually corporate canteens, where this is being used as a queue busting method. So you have the same meal over and over. It's the same merchant. It's a 40 rupee meal that you're having. So once you have that favorited in your app, you're going to just pay while you're standing in the queue, and when you are at the counter, you'll just give your name, the merchant verifies whether that name is there, and he's going to hand over the coupon or the plate, right? So actually this is a big use case when it's a captive sort of audience. We see a lot of adoption in bill payments where Tata Sky had been running this campaign for almost a year. They claim that almost 20% of the traffic has gone to the QR, where the QR is displayed on the TV. So you could pretty much go into your Tata Sky account on the TV. It shows the amount that you need to pay. You can sit on your couch and scan the QR on the TV and make that payment. So you don't have to worry about what is my account number, what's the bank that I should pay and all that. No, it's sub 5-10 seconds. I can show you a transaction. Yeah, it's yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, could you comment on the consumer apps which you use to pay for Bharat QR? Not all of them have come on board with Bharat QR. For example, Paytm, PhonePe, Chiller. So why is that the case? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so if you look at UPI, UPI had unbundled the bank account from the payment method, right? Cards inherently, it's bundled with your banking product. So to put this in context, uh, uh, almost all the banking apps today have Bharat QR as a payment method. Okay, and cards operate on a legacy tech where the entire box sits within the firewalls of the bank. So if when you use your card, there are two things that happen. One, you get authenticated for the transaction. So whatever pin that you enter, that gets validated. And number two, the money gets debited from your account. So both these actions actually happen within the firewalls of the bank, right? In the UPI world, when it's a PhonePe or a chiller, that those two aspects are sort of actually been broken. So you have authentication happening at PhonePe's end, but the authorization happens with an underlying bank account. So so that new method of making payment, banks will not be able to take out their card numbers and give it out to a third party app to process. That's how the technology is structured. So I don't know if it answered your question, but you will not have PhonePe having a Bharat QR option simply because they don't have a plumbing into the bank account directly. Yeah, so the UPI serves that purpose, right? So UPI today, what does it do is that it dips into your bank account and you could have any payment use case on the other side. So absolutely, yeah, yeah. So this QR code will carry the merchant's VPA as well. So if you use a Tez or a PhonePe app, you'll still be able to pay using your existing PSP app.
Hey, the question on beacon.
Yeah.
So when you place a beacon, how does the flow differ? And I think you mentioned about the capital costs when it comes to some of the other modes and how Bharat QR is cheaper.
Yeah.
So when you place a beacon, how is the flow different and what additional capital cost is incurred generally in the whole flow?
Yeah. So what happens is that you have QR as a base, product, and what QR does is that it provides merchant information, right? Which is what a POS machine also does. It ties a transaction to a merchant information, right? So there are use cases around, so if you are to visit a supermarket, if there are offers being driven by an FMCG company, that's where the beacon sort of comes in. So it's being tested out in terms of saying that in Reliance Retail, there's a pilot out where they're trying to see if they're able to drive offers when you pay or pick up certain SKUs. So those offers get applied as you sort of check out for that transaction, right? So the various methods or form factors in which this QR can go in essentially is being driven by what is the merchant use case. Like for example, NFC in the campus example, NFC becomes a great tool to actually make that payment. You don't even have to open your phone. A lot of the canteens have a very poor internet connection. So there, NFC will find relevance. Similarly, if you go to a supermarket, beacon becomes relevant because you can put it up on a end of a rack, and whichever consumer is sort of transiting to that, the offer can get extended. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Nishant Kumar. He's going to talk about the year that wasn't, reviewing payments regulations. Nishant Kumar is a senior policy associate at Dwara Research. He will give us an overview of the payments ecosystem in India and evolution of regulation of different entities.
Check, check. Okay, cool. Works. It's fine, I can do this. It's fine. Okay. Hi guys, my name is Nishant. I work at a place called Dwara Research, and I predominantly do policy research, which deals with financial systems design. So my topic here is to talk about payments regulation and review what has happened over the year. And before we sort of get into what I do and sort of going back into this topic, I just want to show you two pictures. And given that most of you work in this space, these aren't going to be complete news to you, but it's still something that we would like to sort of see. Is in the space of retail electronic payments, we've seen that volume of payments over the year, and given this starting with of the year from demonetization in 2016, we've seen several policy pushes towards increasing retail electronic payments, right? So to just take a look at what has happened over the year in terms of participation, we've seen that there is 11% growth in volumes of all electronic payments. And that is in general a good thing, because over the last year, starting from demonetization and several other policy efforts, as well as expansion in the market quite heavily, we've seen growth in terms of all sort of payments modes. And this growth is sort of typified by the fact that UPI, USSD, and other small value, typically transaction modes which are for small value transactions, you've seen immense growth in that, and which could in some sense say that yes, there has been sustained growth in participation in these retail electronic payment modes, right? And yet, this is a nice picture that came out as part of a Live Mint piece in November 2017. Sorry about that. But which basically tells you, if you were to look at ATM withdrawals, or the amount of cash is still being the most preferred use in terms of payment, right? So you've seen the level of ATM withdrawals have come back up to pre-demonetization levels, and this graph shows you, and if you sort of look at the green line here, right, it sort of gives you the ratio to the amount of ATM withdrawals over narrow money, or M1. M1 is typically this financial term that's used for anything that is cash or cash-like modes of payment, which is just demand deposits in your bank account plus currency in circulation, right? So if you see that, it's very interesting that it comes back up almost to the levels of what it was in early 2016 or 2015, and which would beg the question of whether or not we have in some sense become a less cash economy. Have we started truly adopted as an economy, in like the most macro term possible, the macro sense possible, have we truly adopted to actually transacting in more retail electronic payment modes, right? And this is sort of where we wanted to analyze over the year. There have been various, of course, like the presentation before, which talked about Bharat QR. There's been a lot of industry-led efforts. There's a lot of market infrastructure that's being built. But then there's also been a lot of policy changes that has been made in order to sort of incentivize this move towards having more digital payments in general. And that's sort of what I'm going to talk about, which is what is the role of regulation or policy in this space, and how has it affected over the year. And I probably cheated a little bit in sort of showing you what it hasn't achieved already in this year. But that not necessarily means that I would want to go through what those changes are and sort of see if some of these might have a latent effect and some of these might have an effect in the future, and maybe we can sort of gauge whether there are at least in terms of regulation and policy, are they moving towards in the right direction, right? So sort of before I quickly get into what the exact policy changes were, we sort of want to discuss what is the role of regulation in this. And here we want to talk about a little bit about RBI, right? RBI is the principal regulator in this sort of space, and then the in terms of a first principles context, you would assume that the role of the regulator here is to maintain certain core principles. There are certain non-negotiables that comes when you're talking about payments and payments regulation, purely because of the importance of the function that it offers. In a design perspective, given that we look at financial systems design, from a design perspective, you look at it, payments is usually like the pipelining towards the entire financial system. So whether or not whoever the institutions are, how I connect every transaction between financial institutions, between consumers and businesses, between business and institutions, are connected through different modes of payment. And typically we've seen over the last few years, this is last few decades, this has become largely electronic, right? So this is a very much an important space for the regulator. And the core principles that the regulator would typically look at is financial stability, consumer protection, market conduct, anti-money laundering, and institution neutrality. And this is pretty much like as broad as they are, right? So the way you would want to influence or maintain these principles is through sort of regular policy checks and regulation. And this is again from a first principles context, not necessarily saying the regulator is doing all that, but from a first principles context. And although like typically, at least in the market, it's usually we think of regulation as rule setting and enforcement, right? So if we sort of step back and look at what RBI has done over the years, at least the intention towards has been the development of the payment space. And this is in some sense a little too much interest in the fact that they've started releasing visions for their payment systems and payment system regulation since the end of since the late 90s, right? So RBI puts out on a regular basis vision documents which talk about what they plan to have done in the next few years in terms of policy and regulation, and how to better create an atmosphere for payments, right? So the Vision 2018 statement says they wanted to build more or less cash India by influencing the payment settlement systems through robust regulation, through responsive regulation, robust infrastructure, and effective supervision and customer centricity, right? So these are all things that you would typically see in any sort of vision statement, all broad statements that have been made. But if you take a step back and look at it, it's actually a good thing given that the interest is there in sort of developing the market, right? And this is something that it's often seen as the mandate of a regulator, is to also look at the development of an emerging market, especially if it is of primal importance to the system. And they do this typically, like there is a lot of often regulators and policymakers like their 5 C's, their 3 C's, and all that sort of a framework. But what they do put out in their vision statement is to have better coverage, convenience, confidence, which was an important aspect that we touched upon even in the last presentation. Convergence in terms of making sure all policy, all institutions that perform these functions are at par or almost at the right scale, having a level playing field, and most importantly, cost, right? So as a regulator, you do have control over certain cost functions that you can handle, and typically what we've seen with the MDR, for example, is a typical example of how RBI is trying to sort of subsidize costs in order to promote the market, which is necessarily comes from its own mandate of developing the space for digital payments, right? So this is sort of something that I wanted to do before starting to look at exact regulations, which is to just put this idea of there is a regulator who's looking at enforcement and setting rules of making sure that the system doesn't crash. And on the other side, you have also this role of developing the market as much as possible. We could debate about the efficacy of these developments, efficacy of these policy transmissions, whether or not they're even doing the right thing or whether or not they're inhibiting growth, innovation, all that. But in a broad sense, there is this mandate to do this. So now typically coming to what has changed this year, right? So there's been, since demonetization, and even before that, we've seen a lot of, government as well as regulator pushes towards sort of enabling this space. And it's almost really surreal, because if you see the number of departments in the government as well as the RBI thinking about regulating, let's say something like PPIs, it's immense. So you had MeitY, which was the Ministry of Electronic Information Technology, and you had RBI coming out with rules for PPIs, which you had not seen so much interest in this space. So what I'm trying to say this is that the fact that there has been so many institutions involved in sort of trying to influence policy just shows the amount of interest there has been. And and if I tied back to a lot of things that have happened over the year has been more or less being influenced by the Vattal Committee on Digital Payments which was constituted in 2016, right? So they came out with medium-term recommendations on how to strengthen the digital payments ecosystem. And my colleague Malvika, I think, had a session last year on this, where she sort of broke down all of the recommendations made by the committee. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of the important changes that have happened can be clubbed, and the recommendations as well, can be clubbed under 4 big buckets. And if you look at these buckets, there would have been, one has been the need or the requirement to have an independent payments regulator, which is not the RBI. And there have been certain, I will come to that in more detail, but that's been a big sort of discussion point across across the regulatory space, as well as in the media, as well as in the market, whether or not there is some bias with the fact that RBI does control and operate the payment systems, as well as regulate payment service providers. And maybe that is a good point to raise, because that might bring out the need for an independent payments regulator. The other sort of interesting recommendation which came out was the interoperability. And we have definitely seen some movement on this. Again, I'll talk about that in a little more detail, to make sure that both from a consumer and a service provider frame of reference, you have interoperability between all payment service providers, including banks and non-banks, right? So that was a big recommendation that came out, and which again was talked about a lot over the year. And and then there was a few on promoting digital payments and disincentivizing cash in general. Again, a lot of these have these were really small recommendations, which were easy to implement, I would suppose. And there has been, and they've taken different forms and shapes. Whereas, and in general, that's something that's continuously happening even without the Vattal Committee. We've seen that happen over the years. You've had additional charges on ATM withdrawals, for example. You've had charges for you to transact out of your digital wallet into a bank account. So these sort of disincentives have already existed, but then we have seen some more of that, and I'll talk about it. And finally, it's about ensuring consumer protection and data protection. This is something that we've not seen as much movement as in this year as we would have liked to seen, because this is a thoroughly important space. And again, there has been a committee that's been constituted to look at this, and generally data protection in a larger sense, on not just finance, but also in other sectors. So that's something we hope to cover as well. So the idea was that these are the big recommendations made by the committee, as well as a lot of changes that we see in the market can be bucketed under these. So coming to the first one, it was the case that, like I said, the Vattal Committee had looked at the fact that RBI was performing both these functions of being an operator as well as a regulator, and maybe it would be more prudent to have, and it would also increase competition if we had an independent payments regulatory board. And to do this independent body, they had two kind of structures that they looked at. One was completely isolated regulators, which was RBI and iPay, which was one structure that they did look at, and the other one, which has been sort of adopted, has been with having an independent committee within the RBI. And that's something that's happened now. The Payments and Settlements Act has been amended to create this special independent body, Payments Regulatory Board within the RBI. And there have been questions on whether or not and what are the functions of these, who what are their main mandates, and what is going to happen in terms of how are they planning to make this make it a level playing field for all service providers. What are the general mandates that they would have? And that's sort of unclear, but what has been clear in some sense has been the fact that the RBI welcomed this move when it did happen and said that it would work much like the Monetary Policy Committee. The Monetary Policy Committee is, for those who might not know, is a committee within the RBI, which is predominantly and very specially equipped to handle the changing of interest rates. While while the considerations on interest rates has been considered by the MPC, the regulator is still the RBI, which then imposes all the rules that have come up from the MPC. So they do sort of envision the PRB to perform in a similar manner. Again, there can be questions about the efficacy of this process, can be questions about how effective this will be in sort of allaying concerns about having a more level playing field, as well as creating a little bit more competition in the space between banks and non-banks, for example, because there is the current narrative is the fact that, and that might be true in a large sense, is payments is pretty much a bank-led sort of industry, and non-banks are pretty much catching up at most points of time because there is an imbalance in terms of function and power. This is one big recommendation that did come through, and maybe something to also sort of look at in terms of what's going to happen in the future. The other big thing which I did touch upon earlier was the whole idea of interoperability, right? So in October, for whoever was already in the industry, you might already know, and in October we had this whole new guidelines for PPIs that were issued, and this sort of allude to the fact that you will have partial interoperability in the beginning, meaning that consumers who have access to money stored in wallet A and wallet B can now transact between those wallets without having to go through their bank account. And those in general, in a larger scheme of things, seem to be something in the right direction, given the fact that they also promised that you would have interoperability with banks. Wallets and banks will also be now interoperable in the future, and this is something that that's something that came out of the recommendations, and also something that market and industry participants that we'd spoken to had said that would be absolutely necessary if we were to sort of compete in the larger market. The picture that I wanted to show you, and again Madhu had probably a better picture, which was similar in sort of showing you how these transactions happen, and the fact that even if interoperability is now enforced, there is some concern of whether or not they would still have to go through the banking system. One of the Vatal committee recommendations was the access to RTGS, which is the bank's payment network, is how they would transact with each other at a real time. But that's probably not something that we don't have enough clarity about, but doesn't seem to be in operation. But it is the case that now you would have partial interoperability through UPI, and that's something that's quite interesting to see how it picks up. I know there's been a lot of concerns within the industry about the deadlines that have been set up. I remember that compliance was required before the 31st of December, and there was a lot of running around to get that done. And what also came out in the guidelines, interestingly, was a full KYC requirement. And this again is something that could be seen as both positive in the long run, but a really and almost a deterrent in the short run for the mobilization of digital payments, especially through wallets. Right? Why this was the case is that earlier, if you had stored amounts and transacted with it, lesser than 10,000 rupees through your wallet, you didn't have to do KYC. And now it is the case that almost all wallet providers are supposed to get complete KYC done for all their customers within 12 months of them having logged in, or since they started using those wallets. sorry, and that comes at a cost because that increases a lot of operational costs for the wallet as well. But and and in some sense it can be rationalized over the longer term, but that's something that happened, and we don't know if that we haven't really seen the effect of how much interoperability will now impact in terms of growth of digital payments yet. But this is one of the largest things that I would say that happened in the policy space. But not to get too much into the details, but then I just wanted to show you a little bit about why to rationalize some of these changes is often if you look at function versus regulation, and you see this across the entire financial system, is that you have different um, hierarchy of financial service providers, and then have graded regulations for them based on their function. So if, for example, if you were to take the payment space, you have functions such as cash out, having in some sense using the value that is stored by the customer with you, and also interoperability, right? So if you look at the PPI, for example, when post this whole change in the guidelines, you now have partial interoperability, but it does come with a full KYC requirement. So this, you can somewhat see this as a sense of harmonization to what would happen with that of a payments bank, right? So payments bank had similar sort of, if you see now that they also have a 1 lakh transaction limit that can be stored, and they also require a full KYC. So if you see, the whole idea is that once there is some sense of the industry has grown large enough, or the particular type of institution has grown large enough, that you can start rationalizing and moving towards the larger setup of what regulations should be, for example, for a bank. And this is again, and to give you a little bit more context, is that why a PPA would not have a cash out facility available, or will have highly restricted use of funds that has been stored with them, can be sort of compared with that of a bank, which has cash out as well as almost complete good use of the funds that are stored with them. Comes with liquidity and capital regulations. Comes with the fact that now, if I am someone who stored money with a bank, the bank has to sort of put them in sort of SLR, or sort of purely liquid instruments that they can make sure that the money is not completely lost. In the PPA setup, you have an escrow arrangement to make sure that funds are used in the right way, and whatever. That could be restrictive, it could not be optimal, but the function there is to make sure that the function overall in both senses is to make sure the funds are kept safe, and also there is liquidity for a customer to pull out cash whenever they want, and there is no sort of crisis that the bank has. But sort of coming back, but just wanted to show this only to sort of say that moves like these might not be completely rational, but can be some things that cannot be looked at independently, and sort of you have to look at what does that mean when I look at harmonization, as in, to a larger extent. Don't want to stress too much about the other two, but then in terms of promoting digital payments and disincentivizing cash usage, something that even Madhu had sort of alluded to was the MDR. The Vattal committee interestingly had said the MDR was in general a nice move in terms of promoting merchants to start accepting digital payments. The reduction in MDR and the whole regime. But what they did say that in the long run, MDR is something that should be set by the market. In the long run, it doesn't make sense to regulate MDR purely on a functional level. What they should be doing is probably regulating the interchange fee, which is the fee between the issuing and the acquiring bank, and not the MDR, and not the rate that, or the fees that is set between the merchant and the bank. And this is something that they did say. But if you see regulations that or the guidelines that came in December, almost a month or month and a half ago, MDR was RBI went in the opposite direction and sort of reduced MDR to now have a component which would be dependent on the size of the merchant. So if there's a merchant whose turnover is less than 20 lakhs, then you would had then and for transactions that are more than 2,000 rupees, then you had a reduction in the MDR costs that would if you would to compare them with a larger merchant. And this RBI's rationalization here was to now I can have more merchants because they feel that the MDR is so low that they would start adopting digital more. The more, and if there are people who have a larger customer base and sort of serve a different sort of customer segment which is not typically have that does not have typically access to merchants that do digital transactions, this would be in some sense sort of enabling, sort of both from a merchant side as well as from a customer side, because as they see that, oh, smaller merchants are accepting, they would also be more willing to pay digitally. Um, but then again, this is something that is worth a good days of debate, because we don't know how the larger sort of implications of having such MDR, and we don't know whether this would be the case if over time RBI realizes that they would slowly take, stop this capping of MDR. Then we don't know whether there will be a sustenance in terms of participation in digital payments. Right now, on the short term, it looks good. Again, we haven't seen the sort of numbers that go with it. And that's one thing that sort of should point out. Finally, on the ensuring customer protection and data protection bit, like I already said, there's the Sri Krishna committee that's going on. My colleague Beni, I think, should be in the afternoon, and she sort of worked a lot on sort of providing recommendations to the committee on the payment side. So that could be something that anybody is interested could talk to her about. On the customer protection side, there's something that has been sort of mixing in lately has been the idea of limited liability. Now RBI has enforced a regime of limited liability on banks. Is that now based on whether or not a customer has reported an unauthorized transaction? So if you are a customer and you have an unauthorized transaction and you report it within 3 days, the entire onus or the liability falls on the bank. Whether and the longer it goes, there would be some amount of liability that the customer takes. So this sort of limited liability framework has been put into place, which is now taking away the onus completely from the customer to have done, to have reported, to have it is their responsibility to claim any money that has been lost through unauthorized transactions. And that sort of regime has been taken over, and this move towards limited liability seems to be a good move towards in terms of customer protection. But we haven't seen that in some sense for the non-bank players, which is essentially could be something that could be in the range, and that could ensure that there is a lot more that there is some amount of consumer protection. And why I sort of say this is, I'll come to that a little bit, but as much as I would really love to give you a scorecard as to how we've done this year, but that's pretty much impossible, because a lot of these changes, as I said, will need some time to see whether or not they've had impact. If it's just a highlighting statement, I would have said no, because of the fact that we still see cash is the most prevailing, and it's almost that it's not even reduced. There's no trend of reduction in terms of cash usage and the preference for cash. So I would have to say that in some sense that they didn't measure up. The changes this year haven't measured up, but that is not to say that they will not have a latent impact. It could be the case that we see them a little bit more. And so how we sort of maybe should think about how policy is measured up is by using RBI's own metrics and sort of see whether or not there has been an increase in coverage. And this is something that we do want some more clarity on, to be something that's often being put up, maybe in some sense like a disclosure, could sort of tell you whether or not there's been increased access. We do feel that there has been increase in the number of POS terminals, and that's something that since demonetization picked up, a number that I read somewhere was about 97% increase in the number of POS terminals in the last year, and that's immense. But we don't know about the participation and the use of those by consumers, and that's something that's important to sort of measure, to make sure that we are on the right track, and also to keep ourselves checked, right? In terms of convenience, we see a lot of movement. Again, the Bharat QR is one sort of move towards it. Interoperability is another. Confidence as well as cost are some things that are still being worked out. We don't know. The confidence does matter a lot in some sense. When we had we'd done a small my colleagues had done a small a sort of a qualitative study in rural areas to see whether or not adoption of mobile payments were picking up. And it's often seen the fact that some of the interviewees had said if transacting by mobile is probably one of the most dangerous things for them, because they often relate to it as fraud. And this was a really powerful statement, and about 50 interviewees, we and all of them in some sense resonated the fact that digital payments was not as they did not feel secure in terms of using it. And this probably is an effort that has to be both from the regulator as well as from market, sort of improve the confidence and in terms of getting new markets and new customer segments to start using digital payments. Then that there seems to be a lot of work that needs to be done on that. In yeah, as I mentioned, cost, yes, we are going through the MDR regime. That's one of the biggest cost reduction factors that we've seen, but we don't know the efficacy of how it will turn out to be in the long run. Just to sort of end this is something that I'd already said. This it's not just the idea of payments, and payments regulation is not just something of primal importance here, but it's also of importance to the entire sector. If you look at it, almost all products and all sort of services that are financial in nature are going through the payment network. And so in some sense we see it as the pipeline. You see the movement towards ENPS, which is for a pension scheme. You see a lot of insurance providers now serving pension products online and through apps, as well as using some of the UPI based as well as other USSD based sort of payment modes to start working these products out to the larger market. So what I'm trying to say is that there is definitely an adjacency to a lot of other financial sectors, a lot of other financial institutions and other products that payments regulation does deal with. And in some sense, if we were to talk about larger financial inclusion and sort of getting in consumer segments that are not typically included already, it's something that, and this is why policy in this space might be of really important and could be of high value here. Sort of I'll stop there. I have about 9 minutes. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now or offline. Yeah.
Around the world. I mean, how does regulation around the world compare with regulation in India?
It's sort of hard to compare in some sense, because again, I mean, it's markets are extremely different in some sense. We have a very different demographic that we're trying to include, very different demographic, and also different sort of behavioral aspects that come into play. But in some sense, a lot of at least our views have been, if I were to give you one country or one regime, it would be Australia, I suppose, because they do have a very pretty robust and more very thoughtful regulations around this space. Especially, and that's something that we are following. The whole idea of independent payments regulator came probably from there. Is that they do have one as well. There are other jurisdictions that do, but in some sense, it's a good model to follow. But nonetheless, we have to balance that with the fact that our demographic is completely different. There will be the need for a lot of fiscal activity and sort of subsidies in terms of getting people on board. But on the regulation side, yeah, I would say that would probably be the best model. But if there's anything more specific as to what aspect, then I can tell you what, because that's probably the best role model I can think of. Anything else?
I was just curious if if there are other ways people go about these, countries go about these regulations.
Which one particularly?
Maybe about interoperability of digital payments.
Oh yes, so interoperability is something that I think all countries did at some point, all regulatory regimes did tackle, because payments were not typically all bank led. You have different sort of, so when you're talking about savings or something, it is global to figure that as something that you would have predominantly with banks. Whereas in payments, it was globally the fact that there were a lot of non-bank players involved. So I think recently EU had PSD, which is the directive which allowed for interoperability between banks and non-banks. So it seems to be, I mean, some countries had done it earlier, but it seems to be a sort of a hurdle that everybody is trying to cross in terms of making sure that there is access completely. And that's also because technology, in some sense, is growing together. I mean, it's all different jurisdictions are facing similar problems.
Hi.
Oh yeah.
Just wanted to ask you, since you mentioned the Sri Krishna committee, which is working on data protection, and also TRI is working on another
Yeah.
data protection thing. So how do you see that those two playing out? What will be the dynamics between the two of those?
I have no idea because of the fact that all we know from either, at least in the Sri committee, has put out a white paper and asked for questions on consultations and something that's they will at some point have to, or at least talk about it. In some sense, the only sort of the hope or why I did mention it there was that there was one part of the committee does talk about changes to laws and legislation, especially in this context, it's the Payments and Settlements Act that would sort of that should take care of data protection aspects, and that's as broad as they've sort of mentioned it. I'm not completely sure. Might have to check, but that's pretty much all there is. At some point, they would have to give out more clear. Right now, it's in the they just finished for public opinion, the time for public opinion. So people are probably giving in their recommendation. But it's the hope that whatever learnings that they do come out with would be significant and would be readily adoptable in terms of making those changes that you'd want in the regulatory environment to protect data, personal data and consumer data. But no real thoughts on how they would interact with those of TRI, for example.
Any more questions? All right, we have a little bit of time left. Okay, thanks, Nishant.
Thank you.
Sorry, Bri?
Like a NFL broadcast. That was normal. I'm very unhealthy.
Yeah.
Welcome back, guys. We have a panel next up on structuring teams and organizations in fintech. It'll be moderated by Adam Walker. And this panel is on how companies need to rethink how they structure internal teams and to be more agile with policy changes and regulations. There'll be time for questions. We'll have volunteers.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Good morning still. So I'm Adam. I'm a product manager at Credex, and we'll be covering the topic of hiring for financial technology companies. Because if you're coming from a pure like tech product background or a pure banking background, the experience you'll find in working at a financial technology company or starting one is that the culture is very different, right? And that will impact the recruiting for your company. So first, I'd like to introduce Chaitra and Lucas. And Aditya, who is the head of engineering at Instamojo, will be joining us in just a few minutes. So to get started, maybe Chaitra, you could give a little background of your startup, Simple, as well as maybe tell us what you were doing just before you had started the company. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Adam. So I am the co-founder of Simple. Simple is a fintech company. We like to think of ourselves as selling peace of mind to customers. What Simple does is our model is inspired by the Kirana store Khata. So we work with online merchants to give them the capability to provide a VIP checkout experience to their best customers. And that is powered by a line of credit, which is what Simple provides. And it's an end-to-end platform. So we take care of the invoicing, the billing, and the settlement, everything. The idea is to eliminate friction at the point of sale and also post-purchase. My background before starting Simple was by training, I'm an engineer and I also got a business degree. I worked as a software engineer long back, but it kind of feels like in my past life. For the most part, after business school, which was about 10 years, 11 years ago, I've worked in launching new business initiatives for small and mid-sized companies. So that's been my main background. I would qualify myself more as a product manager before I started Simple.
Thank you. And Lucas, why don't you tell us a little bit about your company, Namaste Credit,
Sure.
and your background. Thanks.
Hello. Okay. So Lucas Bianchi, I founded Namaste Credit, or co-founded Namaste Credit, which is an online marketplace for loans. We're very focused on SME loans, and I think what kind of differentiates us is the fact that we do all kinds of SME loans. Often when people think of SME loans, they think of unsecured SME loans, but we do all kinds. And so we've developed a platform that speeds up the process, improves it, engages all kinds of different parties, from the lenders to channel partners to the borrowers themselves. Before Namaste Credit, I had helped build a company called Copal Partners, which we sold to Moody's ultimately. So it was a financial research and analytics outsourcing firm, not very tech oriented at all, really. But I helped build it and bring on clients in the U.S. as a head of BD in the U.S. And we ended up selling it for about $500 million to Moody's. So after that, wanted to find something more exciting to do than work at Moody's for while. Before that, I was actually an equity research analyst. So my background is in finance, and I'd worked at several banks before. And so myself and my co-founder actually brought the finance experience that Adam was speaking about just a minute ago. And then we partnered with a CTO based here in Bangalore, because this is where all the best tech is built, right? So that's it.
Thanks, Lucas. And Aditya, welcome. Thanks for coming. So Aditya is the head of engineering at Instamojo. So maybe if you could tell us maybe a little bit about what you do, and then maybe what you were doing just before Instamojo. Although I know you're part of the founding team, the company, right? So please.
So I'm Aditya Sengupta. I'm one of the co-founders of Instamojo. So I take care of engineering, risk, and compliance. Before Instamojo, I was a research fellow at IIT Bombay, which was essentially the first position I had after my engineering. At Instamojo, we help small merchants accept payments on the internet. We try to make it so that they don't have to deal with banks, they don't have to deal with paperwork. If they don't need to, they don't have to deal with integrations at all, right? So we try, like, so for instance, if you're a musician and you just want to sell some music online, you shouldn't have to set up a website, host your music somewhere, then integrate with a payment gateway, talk to a bank. So the idea is that you should be able to come to us, upload your music to us, get a link and share that with your customers. It's as simple as that, right? And we try to do this for a wide range of use cases, not just, obviously not just files or music, right? So yeah, the key objective is to make it easy for small merchants to accept payments on the internet.
Great. Thanks, Aditya. So I'm going to follow up a question with you about how engineering at your organization is impacted by just the nature of being a payments company, where you're obviously regulated, right? But your core product is a software product, right? So if you could share a little bit about how that's impacted the way you think about recruiting at your company, as well as just sort of the DNA, the mindset of the organization when it comes to product.
Yeah, so an important part of being in the fintech space is to make sure that there are certain attributes or aspects which you take care of very carefully, right? So for instance, security is paramount. If somebody enters their card number on your page, you don't want that card number to get leaked and be used by someone else. You have to have a very strong bias for correctness, right? I mean, if your bank showed you the wrong balance, you would completely lose faith in them. And these are aspects which kind of differ from, say, a very fast-moving product company. Whereas, like, I mean, you'd really want to be able to focus on deploying things quickly. In a fast-moving product company, you'd ideally be okay with a bit of breakage, a bit of failure. Whereas there are many aspects of a payment company where you absolutely cannot be okay with breakage and failure, right? I mean, you going down could impact somebody else's livelihood, entire livelihood, right? So at the company, we silo ourselves into, like, I mean, we have several silos, so to speak, and there are parts of the company which have a certain kind of DNA, and there are other parts of the company which have a different DNA, right? So, for instance, our payment and platform teams have all these DNA attributes which I just spoke about, whereas our growth team has a very different DNA, right? So, if you're setting up a landing page, if you're setting up the registration process, that we are okay with like a much more fast-moving culture, where we are okay with breakage once in a while. Whereas on our payment workflows, we are absolutely not okay with that, right?
And how does that impact your release cycles?
So typically in a day we do like maybe 5 to 10 releases. At high level, we still move pretty fast. What we do is we try to take the best of everything that we know of, that we are aware of as an engineering culture, and we try to amalgamate that, right? So a lot of folks in fintech are used to very large release cycles where you take like say an extremely large feature, you build the entire thing out, get it vetted by compliance, legal, operations, and then you release it, right? There are security audits in certain industries that you have to take care of. So there's a lot more to do to get something out to a production server in fintech typically. Whereas in like one of the best workflows in product companies is that you do a very iterative release cycle where say you take like a large feature down, break it down into weekly sprints, then you take small components of that and just keep deploying those to production, right? So we try to take a mix of both, and so we make sure that what's going out is secure. We have a very strong peer review process. I mean, you cannot, so nobody can merge their own code in. You have to get it vetted by someone else. We make sure that the people who are at least vetting the code, they have background checks, which you have to do. For instance, if you are under PCI compliance, you cannot push something like, not everyone can push stuff to your servers, right? So we try to make sure that we amalgamate various best practices and get the best out of that.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. So I have a question for you both. Have you found that as awareness and as people move from more offline activities to online in their discovery, right, of products, and maybe your companies haven't been around long enough, but maybe you have seen a little bit of this, how that's impacted the culture of your organization, where maybe you had more of an outbound activity initially, and now you have more of an inbound one, right? And maybe Lucas, you can speak a little bit about this because most of your clients, right, are more offline. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
Okay, great. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, how that's maybe impacted. So if you're thinking about things from a business development perspective, how that's impacted the culture of your organizations.
Sure. So I'd say our core customer set is still largely offline.
And what types of businesses do you work with?
All kinds of SMEs.
Okay.
Like
Give me an example.
Across the board, from schools, educational institutions, retailers, wholesalers of all kinds of things, small manufacturers, etc. Basically, any company that that has turnover between 1 and 50 crores. Okay. That's kind of the core customer set. So, so the very end customers, which are the ones getting loans through us, basically are largely still offline, and in our space, they tend to work with intermediaries, right? Have channel partners, have people that they trust and know that do things for them. And that goes for loans as well as many other things, right? So what I've found is, especially in India, people tend to have, other people do things for them. And so that goes very much in our space. And so what we've done is engaged a number of the channel partners, some of which are offline, but a number of which are also online, and to a certain extent train them to work with us online. And so that's how we have worked, kind of having champions, if you will, that have a broader reach out into the broader, say, Indian community of businesses, but that they themselves are fairly adept at doing things online. Okay. So that's kind of been the strategy that we've deployed. We continue to do that. I'd say there's been maybe a minor shift of even the channel partners coming online, or yeah, somewhat more significant shift in the channel partners coming online. These are people like chartered accountants, right, that tend to have to do things online anyway, like file taxes for their clients, like file compliance paperwork for their clients. And so that shift has been happening kind of naturally, but we have been pushing it a little more through, again, kind of training them on it, asking them to do this stuff, and ultimately showing them the benefit, right? When you get a big benefit out of doing something in a particular manner, then you'll continue doing it in that manner, or you'll start doing it in that manner and then do it even more. So in our case, the big benefit of working online is that you're actually able to apply with many different lenders at the same time, right? If you try to do that in an offline fashion, it's kind of impossible. Trying to approach 10 different lenders at the same time is not really feasible. And so doing it online is the benefit that the channel partners get, basically.
Okay. And so has there been learning, over the last, it's been about 3 years since you started the company?
Yeah, almost 3 years.
Okay. And so when you first started and how you thought you'd go about sales, right, and what channels would work, how things had changed and how that's impacted your recruiting. So say from maybe it was more of an outbound strategy to now more of an inbound one, maybe more offline versus online. How has that affected things in your organization?
Well, we actually tried to push the online element with channel partners from the beginning.
Okay.
So we actually haven't changed that element too much.
Okay.
I'd say the type of channel partners that we've engaged has changed somewhat.
Okay.
Where today we're working more with channels that were already in the loan facilitation business before, and we have just trained them to do the online portion of it. Before, when we started, we were a little bit more focused on folks that had never done loans before, type of thing, and so that was the shift. But maybe they were really active online already, doing other things.
Okay.
Right. So
that makes sense.
So,
okay. So there was a little bit of a behavior already. As far as doing some activities online.
That's again, we started with those types of folks, but we found that some knowledge of the loan process is important to set expectations with the end clients as well. And so again, we've focused a little bit more on folks that are already in the loan business or loan facilitation business, but hadn't done anything online before as such. So we've trained them to come online to do things, shown them the benefit of it, etc.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And Chaitra, do you have anything to share on this topic, as far as sales and marketing, how things have changed in your expectations when you were first starting the company, and maybe also if you could speak a little bit about. Is there a regulatory aspect that you have to be concerned about with your business?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So if you could share a little bit about that as well with Simple.
Sure. So I think for Simple, when we started off, the nature of the business that we were in, we were planning to provide credit as a convenience to our customers. So naturally, regulation was a big question mark in front of us. And so for us, me and my co-founder, we had to address regulation even before we were able to raise the seed round. Right? We had to figure out a solution there. And the way we went about it was, one is, we spent a lot of time ourselves trying to understand what are the possibilities under law, what are the do's and don'ts that are clearly defined, what is the gray area, and where is there room for creativity, right? So when you're trying to invent something very new, I think the whole, like for us, the entire approach was we were like the entire traditional payment infrastructure is a legacy of the MasterCard Visa era, and we thought that needs to change, right? And the only way that will change is you have to create something new from ground up. So when you're creating something new from ground up, there's one advantage that, it's new, so you're reimagining the world, so you have a lot of flexibility in that sense, but you also need to operate in the real world, and therefore you need to understand to some extent what are the boundaries of the actual world that you're operating in. So we spoke to we reached out to advisors, people who are experts in this space, some of you must have heard of Shinjini. She used to be the CEO of Paytm Payments Bank. Now she's the head of Citibank Retail in India. So she was our advisor. She at that time she used to work with PwC. She's ex RBI. So we found a great mentor in her, and she really helped us figure out the compliance structuring for our business. We had to do that before going to even raising our seed round, because that was the first question that was asked of us. Once that compliance piece was figured out, then it was about going up and going ahead and setting up the team. And I guess for us, what our approach to hiring, where it differed, especially in the early days to now, so we are about 2.5 years old now. In the early days, the most important thing for us, since we were reimagining the future, was the ability to think based on first principles. So if you look at the first set of people that Simple hired, the first 10 people, that was the single most important criteria for us. Being able to think on first principles, not being blinded by how things are, being able to ask why not, and what else, what would the ideal solution be, right? So that was important. And of course, now things have changed. 2.5 years in, I guess the way things have evolved for us. In the beginning, from a sales perspective, the way we were very clear that the nature of the business that we were in, going after the long tail, would require a lot of feet on the street, and that was not the model we wanted to go after. So in that sense, we are different from InstaMojo, which is you cater more to the long tail. So we went after mid and large size merchants. So for almost 1.5 years, our sales team was just one person. So it was the co-founders and there was one more guy. And then we added more capacity. Now in the last, I would say 6 months, we have started receiving a lot of inbound requests from the smaller merchants, and therefore now we have shifted more towards inbound. We hired a couple of people who can take care of the inbound leads and also reach out to the smaller merchants. But our entire strategy, again, to go after the long tail is partnering with the likes of either InstaMojo, Razorpay, etc. So a channel distribution through a payment gateway is what we are looking at, as opposed to going and integrating with each merchant ourselves. Then I guess the last question that you were asking. So in one more thing that sort of crops up in Simple's case is credit risk, right? So we are giving people credit, and therefore risk is a big thing. But again, if there are any entrepreneurs in the room, the question to ask yourselves is, on day one, do you really need somebody who's a risk expert? What will that person even do when you don't even know what the set of customers who are going to adopt your service are, like how they're going to behave, etc. So if that capability exists in the founders, it's great. So my co-founder Nitya, he was ex-Wall Street. He used to have a credit mortgage-backed security background, but of course it was in a different context, in a different country. However, the fundamental vocabulary of credit and the frameworks of credit was kind of covered, and we managed with that for about 2.5 years. However, now in the last 3 months, of course, as we grow up and we scale, now we definitely need somebody who's more comes with experience, who comes with who can give us the clout that is required and the discipline that is required around credit. So we are hiring somebody who's experienced. So I guess that's just a framework to think about. What would same thing goes to data science. Like early on, when you don't even have any data, what will you do with unless as a founder you're an expert yourself? What will you do with somebody who is like a machine learning or an AI expert, right? That person is most likely going to get bored. So it's important to think about I guess what your needs are early on, and as they evolve, you start adding capacity on that front.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And risk, I'm sure, is also very important, right, at InstaMojo. Is there also an element of that for Namaste Credit, Lucas? Not so much, right? You're not the ones with the loan book, right? Okay, great. But maybe Aditya, if you could speak a little bit about that at a payments company, because I don't think probably majority of folks don't realize that that's an element of your business model, right? You end up rejecting certain merchants, right? So if you could share more about this activity and maybe some of the folks who are involved with that activity. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, obviously risk is one of our most important focus areas, right? And one of the things we did was focus on risk from a very, very early point in time, right? Because for us, we make a very, very, very small amount of money in terms of, like, say, if there's 100 rupees being transacted, we make a few basis, like a fraction of 1%, right? So 100 rupees being lost implies that's like the loss of revenue on like several, like I think a few hundred transactions, right? So one merchant going bad can wipe us out, right? So for us, this is something that we focus on at a very early stage. This is some feedback we had gotten from, I don't know if you've heard of DJ Patil, the guy who went on to become the chief data scientist of the United States, right? So he pushed us to focus on risk at a very early point. So one important thing about risk is that it's a function of how long you do it and how well you learn, right? So if you start very late, you're going to get hammered by people who are, because if you already have a lot of money moving in, you're going to get completely hammered by people who are already experienced at pulling money out of you. So this is a function we started very early, and we focused on hiring from companies which have a very strong focus on risk. So we'd hired from people like PayPal, Amazon. In India, we hired from people like Flipkart. So the folks we have in our risk team bring in a lot of their prior experience. And that's generally our hiring philosophy across the board. We try to bring in people who bring in a lot of diversity, a lot of experience, right? And we largely give them a free hand and allow them to do like what they feel is right. And yeah, we're still here, so we've not been wiped out. So I guess we're lucky that way.
Good. You're risk aware enough, right, to still be here today. No, thank you very much. And another question. We have about maybe 5 more minutes here, and then we'll have another 5 minutes for question and answer. So wanted to ask the three of you, some insights maybe for. Oh, this is included, so we have about 1 minute. Okay, great. Thank you. So just quickly, maybe if you could share some maybe sources for recruiting, like certain industries that you found fit well with your organization's DNA. My experience has been that we're a company that has a financial product, CredX, but we've found that our salespeople tend to, the best performers are ones that come from typically doing sales jobs at inbound sales jobs at services companies like digital marketing services versus former bankers. So I'd like to hear if you guys can share some great sources, some tips for the audience.
I mean, we are still very small, so we are like a 50% team, and if 20, 30, about half of them are product and engineering. So for us, I guess the main source, especially for the product development team, is internal referrals. So I think the most powerful source has been using your own initial team, and then use the network of the people that are already in your team, starting from the founders, to start hiring. Serendipity has honestly played a very heavy role. We've been lucky enough to meet, especially in the early days, the right types of people at sort of events like this that we were randomly attending, and those right set of people knew many right sets of people, and we were able to hire. So I think very, very important for me personally, I would think, is especially in terms of your engineering team, is hiring the right leaders. And if you hire the right leaders, people with the right networks, they'll be able to bring, it's like the whole queen bee model, right? If you have the queen bee, then the worker bees will kind of come. That has been there. And another thing with respect to hiring that has changed from the beginning versus now is most functions in the early days, we were focused more on generalists, because when you're young, you need people who can do a lot of things well. But I think as you get older, there are certain areas, I guess I agree with Aditya, like what he was saying earlier, there are certain, depends on, there are certain areas where you need security, correctness, reliability, but there are certain areas where you need to be able to build fast and break things, right? So depending on those, the nature of your evolution and your needs at any given stage, specialists start becoming necessary as you grow older. So I guess that's kind of how our needs have changed.
Can you guys maybe give like a few words answer Because I think we'll cut to a Q&A in a moment. Yeah.
I'll be quick.
All right,
Basically,
thanks.
on the tech
Thanks,
side,
Chaitra.
it's been everything and everywhere. Referrals, recruiters, just knockery kind of thing. The main thing being, kind of a rigorous interview process and folks initially, like you were mentioning, that have a broad kind of view and vision and capability set and interest level. And then as you grow, then having more specialized people. On the sales side, we actually haven't had a great experience with bankers either, and have also not had a great experience or done much actually with digital marketers, like you were saying, but rather bringing in folks from a diverse set of sales backgrounds that basically know how to engage people and train people. Like I was mentioning before, we're in the business of training people to get online and use our platform and all that. So that's been our experience on the sales side.
Thank you.
So of all the functions we have, or of all the things we do at InstaMojo, I think hiring is by far the hardest, like by an order of magnitude, right? So to add to what everybody else said, I mean, we do all of that. Our primary focus is on hiring from other product companies. We tend to avoid services-based companies because we found that the DNA just doesn't like work well with us. Apart from that, we look at product companies and then we try not to really pigeonhole ourselves into like certain product companies or certain types of product companies there. We try to get as much diversity as we can.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We have room for 2 questions. Great. 2 minutes. 1 question.
Just a reminder, this is a panel, so it'll be recorded. These guys will be available later. If you want to have a more candid conversation, you can find them offline.
Hi, I have a question for Chaitra because she mentioned that you insisted on first principles thinking when you're hiring. I think that's one of the most difficult attributes to look for in a person. Could you give an example of how you hired somebody who showed these attributes very early on in the interview process?
That's a great question. You're putting me on a spot here now. So I guess for me, there was, I have to go back in time 2.5 years. But when I did not honestly at that time have a very structured like list of questions that if I ask A, B, C, and D, I'll get to know whether this person thinks first principles or not. It was, I guess, the main approach I take, it's twofold. One is get them to talk about the decisions that they've made in the past and ask them why they've made the decisions that they've made. And that's been my main window into ascertaining whether this person thinks based on first principles or not. And also it gives me an insight into their value systems. Right? And I think one super critical thing for us, and probably true for any startup, is you want, as I think Aditya mentioned, the DNA needs to match. I guess the DNA is nothing but a reflection of the operating values that are important to you as a company and the person coming in. So asking why behind each decision, it could be changing of jobs, it could be a certain project they executed in a certain way. Getting to the bottom of it has helped me.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, I think that's it, right? Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Also, Chaitra, thank you so much. Lucas, thank you. Ditya, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, pleasure. Yeah. Oh, okay. And all of us are going to be available outside of the auditorium. So happy to chat one-on-one with folks. Thanks.
Hello. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. You can. No, I'll intro. No problem. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next Birds of Feather session on evolution of on the future of POS. We have with us Abhishek Ahegari from Payu. We have Shrikant Lakshman representing Cashless Consumer, and we have Dishant from Dwara Research. A few ground rules before we kind of begin the session. The Chatham House rules apply, which is that if you're tweeting or write or making notes about the session, you cannot attribute it to anybody. So everybody comments etc. remain anonymous over here. Otherwise, you can talk about it. So what we're going to do in this discussion today is we'll break it down into two parts. The first section of the discussion